The fluorescent lights in the hallway flickered with the dull persistence of a room that had seen too many tired faces and tense silences. Denise Bartlett sat upright in the hardbacked chair outside courtroom 3B of the Hamilton County Courthouse. In Cincinnati, Ohio. The old linoleum floors echoed every footstep, and the muted gray walls seemed to absorb the quiet anxiety of everyone waiting for their names to be called. She clutched a manila folder on her lap with both hands, her thumb brushing against the creased edge of a document she had reviewed at least 100 times. She was wearing a navy blue blazer, crisp but slightly dated, and a pair of low-heeled black shoes that had served her through years of parent-teacher conferences and school board meetings. Her face was composed, but her eyes betrayed the tension she tried not to show. At 59, recently retired and still adjusting to the hollow quiet of her home, Denise had imagined a different kind of post-career life: garden walks, book clubs, maybe travel. Not this. Across the hall, the two attorneys representing her late brother's ex-wife and adult son paced casually, checking their phones, occasionally smirking in her direction. They hadn't expected her to represent herself. They certainly hadn't expected her to arrive early, prepared, and apparently unshaken. Her late brother, Thomas, had died unexpectedly 8 months ago. His will, at least the official version, filed by the family attorney, split his sizable estate between his son, Brad, and his ex-wife, Lorna. Denise had always found that strange, considering how bitter the divorce had been and how little contact Thomas had maintained with either of them. But grief had a way of unraveling certainty, and no one in the family had been eager to confront the legal machinery. No one except Denise. What the others didn't know, or had chosen to ignore, was the handwritten addendum Thomas had mailed to her just 2 months before his death. In it, he expressed regrets, rethought priorities, and redirected most of his estate to 2 local nonprofits he deeply cared about, with a portion left to Denise to manage the charitable transition. She hadn't wanted the money, but she couldn't ignore his clear intentions. She owed him that much. The courtroom door creaked open. A bailiff called, "Bartlett versus King and King, parties, please enter." Denise stood, spine straightening as if to remind herself she belonged there. She followed the attorneys inside. The courtroom was utilitarian: stale air, oak panels, an American flag drooping slightly behind the judge's bench. Judge Raymond Callahan sat center stage, a man in his 60s with eyes that seemed permanently half-lidded from decades of legal fatigue. He didn't look up when they entered. "Let's keep this brief," he muttered, tapping the side of a file folder with a pen. "We've got a packed docket today." Denise moved to the side table, placing her folder in front of her. She could feel the attorney's eyes on her, amused and mildly irritated. The lead attorney, Samuel King, adjusted his tie and leaned forward. "Your Honor," he began smoothly, "we maintain that the will in question is legally binding, notarized, and clear in its intent. My client, Lorna King, and her son, Brad, are the rightful heirs to Mr. Thomas Bartlett's estate as per the document filed with the court. There is no legal basis for a challenge, and we're concerned about the unnecessary prolonging of probate by Ms. Bartlett, who has no legal training and appears to be acting on sentiment." Judge Callahan gave a tired nod. "And Ms. Bartlett, what exactly is your position?" Denise stood. Her voice was calm but firm. "Your Honor, I'm not contesting the original will. I'm asking the court to consider a handwritten addendum, dated March 12 of last year, which Thomas Bartlett sent to me directly. I have provided a certified copy to the court and request that it be reviewed alongside the existing documentation." King cut in immediately. "Your Honor, this so-called addendum was not filed with the initial paperwork, is not notarized, and," "Let her finish," the judge interrupted, though more out of routine than conviction. Denise didn't falter. "The letter references specific charitable organizations, includes his signature, and outlines his change of mind. I believe it shows clear intent and should be considered." The judge sighed, glancing at the stack of papers before him. "Ms. Bartlett, we've reviewed the initial filings. If the addendum isn't properly witnessed or notarized, it holds little weight in probate. I don't see a reason to drag this out. You can leave. We're done here." Denise blinked. For a second, the words didn't compute. The attorneys began gathering their things, already half standing. The bailiff turned toward the door. She remained still. "Your Honor," she said, voice measured. "You haven't read the addendum. It's not in the file you're holding. The clerk told me this morning it was placed in the supplemental folder." Judge Callahan looked up for the first time. "Excuse me?" She took one careful step forward, picking up her copy of the letter. "It was placed in the supplemental folder labeled, Bartlett Addendum. It's not in the main file. I confirmed with the clerk, Ms. Jennings, before the session began." The room paused. The judge glanced toward his clerk, who immediately turned and began rifling through a side drawer of folders. Moments later, she pulled out a thin yellow file and handed it up to the bench. Callahan opened it. His brow furrowed. King stepped forward. Your Honor, I still object to the judge raised a hand sharply. Sit down. He read. The room fell into silence again. The fluorescent lights hummed softly above them, indifferent to the shift in energy. Denise remained standing, hands folded in front of her. After what felt like several minutes, Judge Callahan looked up. His voice had changed. Lower. Slower. This document references specific distributions not aligned with the previously filed will. It includes full names, detailed intentions. It may not be notarized, but it's dated. Signed. King stood frozen, eyes darting to his colleague. Callahan cleared his throat. We're not done here after all. Denise sat back down. Her heart was calm now. Not triumphant. Just steady. The courtroom had listened, finally. Denise sat in the dim light of her kitchen early the next morning, the soft gurgle of her coffee maker the only sound in the quiet house. A cardinal tapped at the glass of her window, the only flash of color against the overcast Ohio sky. Her manila folder lay open on the table, the original handwritten letter spread carefully beside it. She didn't need to read it again. She knew every curve of Thomas's handwriting, every nuance in his tone, but she read it anyway. March 12, 2024. Denise, I don't trust lawyers anymore. I'm not even sure I trust the system to do right by anyone without a fight. But I do trust you. By the time you read this, you'll probably be the only one willing to stand up and say, wait, this doesn't feel right. You were always the one who noticed the small things, the things everyone else missed or ignored. I've changed my mind. The formal will stands, yes, but I want this letter to speak louder. I don't want Lorna and Brad to inherit everything. You know how things really were between us. That money doesn't belong to people who couldn't pick up the phone unless they wanted something. I've been thinking about the food pantry on 8th Street. About Carter House, where I've been volunteering weekends. Those places saved me from losing my mind after the divorce. And you've always tried to keep me grounded. You always saw through my anger, my bad decisions. I want you to manage what's left. I trust your judgment. I trust your heart. If this letter doesn't make it through the right channels, I understand. But at least you'll know. And maybe that's enough. Her eyes welled, but she didn't let the tears fall. She wiped her hands on a napkin and reached for her coffee instead. There was no time for sentimentality now. There was too much to prepare. She had already anticipated the argument from the opposing attorneys. The lack of notarization, the emotional bias, the argument that the letter was nothing more than a personal note, not a legal amendment. But what they didn't understand, or refused to acknowledge, was the legal concept of intent. And even in probate court, intent mattered. She picked up her phone and scrolled through her contacts. Her friend Janice, a former district clerk turned paralegal, answered on the second ring. Denise? You okay? Still standing, Denise said, a smile tugging at her lips despite everything. Listen, I need a little help navigating this. I need to make sure that letter is treated as part of the will. I think we have a window now that the judge has seen it. Janice didn't hesitate. You're talking about submitting it under the doctrine of holographic will inclusion? That's the one. Ohio doesn't officially recognize holographic wills unless certain conditions are met, but if you can demonstrate clear testamentary intent and mental soundness, it can be considered. Especially if there's corroborating evidence. I have context, Denise said. And a voicemail he left a few days after the letter was sent. I saved it. Good, Janice said. Really good. If he references the letter in it, it strengthens your case. Judges like consistency. They hate mess. Thanks, January. I'll bring everything over later today. After she hung up, Denise sat for a moment, running a hand through her graying hair. Her home was modest, clean, lived in, full of books and quiet corners. Photos of her former students sat side by side with family portraits, and a brass plaque from her retirement party still hung above the doorway. Thank you for always standing up for what's right. That had been her way. Always. She dressed simply, in a dark sweater and slacks, and walked out into the heavy Cincinnati air. The streets buzzed with mid-morning traffic, and the courthouse stood as it always had, imposing, bureaucratic, a building designed not for comfort but for order. She had an appointment with the probate clerk, Ms. Jennings, to formally request the letter be entered as a codicil to the original will. As she waited in line, she caught sight of Brad King across the atrium. He looked younger than she remembered, barely 30, dressed in an expensive gray suit that didn't match the awkwardness in his stance. He was arguing with his lawyer, voice low but sharp. Denise turned her gaze away. She wasn't here to win a fight. She was here to speak for someone who no longer could. Ms. Jennings called her forward. Morning, Ms. Bartlett. I've pulled the addendum file. Judge Callahan's chambers have asked for a supplemental review. I assume you're here to submit more materials. Yes, Denise said, placing a USB drive and a printed transcript on the counter. A voicemail, dated March 15th. It directly references the letter and his intent to revise his will. I've included the chain of custody and date metadata. Jennings raised an eyebrow, clearly impressed. You used to be a principal, right? 21 years. Explains the organization. Denise offered a tight smile. I was good at reading between the lines. She walked out with a receipt in her hand and a strange sense of momentum building inside her. The system wasn't designed for people like her, unrepresented, middle-aged women trying to navigate legal labyrinths alone. But systems were made up of people. And people, for all their flaws, could still listen. And back at home that evening, she opened her laptop and began drafting a brief, plain language, but pointed. She knew the judge wouldn't want legal jargon from someone without a license. He would want clarity, logic, respect, and something undeniable to hold on to. Halfway through, she paused, staring at the open letter again. This wasn't just about money or even justice. It was about reminding people that words mattered. That a quiet man's final change of heart mattered. That a sister's persistence could tip the balance, not through volume or anger, but by simply not giving up. Tomorrow, the court would reconvene, and this time, they'd have to listen all the way to the end. The morning of the second hearing began with a gray drizzle sweeping over downtown Cincinnati. Denise arrived early again, umbrella in hand, her court documents sealed in a new folder, this one labeled in firm black letters, supplemental evidence. Will addendum. Her shoes squeaked slightly against the marble floor as she made her way toward courtroom 3B. Inside, the energy was different. More alert. Court staff moved with a touch more purpose. The clerk, Ms. Jennings, nodded at Denise. When she arrived, eyes flicking down to the folder in her hands. Denise took her seat on the same wooden bench as before, smoothing out the front of her blazer. She didn't need notes today, everything was already in her head. In her bones, even. Across the aisle, Samuel King entered, his colleague trailing behind him with a briefcase full of papers. King looked less relaxed this time. No smirk. Just a tight jaw and furrowed brow. Brad wasn't with them. Denise guessed the attorneys had advised him to keep his distance today, to avoid creating a perception of entitlement in front of the judge. The bailiff opened the doors right at 10 a.m., case 28 to 204, Bartlett vs. King, continued from July 9th. All parties, please enter. Denise walked in and took her seat at the respondent's table. She noticed the addendum folder resting on the judge's bench, a yellow sticky note attached with reviewed 7/11, Callahan, scribbled in sharp, tight handwriting, Judge Raymond. Callahan entered through the side door, robes flowing just above the polished floor. He adjusted his glasses and glanced around the room, lingering half a beat longer on Denise than he had the week before. He cleared his throat and spoke with more gravity than the last time. This session is a continuation of a probate dispute concerning the estate of Thomas Bartlett. At our last hearing, a supplemental document was brought to the court's attention, an unsigned, handwritten letter allegedly penned by the deceased. The court has since reviewed the document and additional evidence submitted on July 10th. He looked toward Denise. Ms. Bartlett, you've requested to speak briefly in support of your motion. You may proceed. She stood slowly. Thank you, Your Honor. She took a step forward, her hands steady on the podium. Your Honor, this isn't about discrediting the original will. I understand how probate works, and I understand the importance of procedure. But I also understand the man my brother was. He wasn't reckless. He wasn't manipulative. And he wouldn't have sent me that letter, signed, dated, filled with specifics, if he hadn't intended for it to mean something. She paused, glancing toward the attorneys, then back at the judge. I've submitted a voicemail dated 3 days after the letter. In it, Thomas tells me he hopes the letter gets there before the lawyers mess everything up. His words, not mine. He jokes that maybe it's a foolish move, but then says, at least you'll know what I meant to do. She took a breath. This wasn't a side note. It was a shift in intention. A final attempt to correct course. And I believe the court has a responsibility to at least consider that. Callahan nodded. Thank you, Ms. Bartlett. Mr. King? Samuel King rose, the rhythm of his steps unusually clipped. He adjusted his cuffs and spoke with restrained urgency. Your Honor, opposing counsel, Ms. Bartlett, has made a heartfelt case. But let's remember the facts. The letter in question was not notarized, not witnessed, and not filed with the official will. Ohio's recognition of holographic wills is narrow and does not extend to documents lacking execution formalities. He turned slightly, his voice rising. There's no dispute that the deceased wrote the letter. But intent alone does not rewrite the law. Emotions, voicemail recordings, and afterthoughts, these do not constitute legally binding directives. He sat down sharply. Judge Callahan rested his elbows on the bench, fingertips pressed together. For several seconds, he said nothing and then. This court has reviewed the document, the voicemail, and the timeline. While Ohio law does not broadly recognize holographic wills, we are permitted to consider testamentary documents under Harper v. Reeves, provided there is clear intent and corroborating evidence. He looked directly at Denise. I find that the letter demonstrates a clear and specific change in intent. The inclusion of named beneficiaries, percentages, and instructions for handling the estate, combined with the voicemail referencing it, constitutes enough grounds to pause distribution and enter a formal review. King rose. Your Honor? Are you saying, I'm saying, the judge interrupted, that this court will not allow the original will to be executed until a hearing on the admissibility of the addendum is complete. And pending that review, Ms. Bartlett is granted temporary standing as executor ad litem to manage any decisions relevant to the letter's terms. Denise didn't move. She wasn't sure if she was breathing. King sat down in disbelief. Callahan stood. Hearing adjourned for today. We reconvene on August 5th. The gavel struck once. Then silence. As the attorneys gathered their things, Denise remained at the table, stunned but composed. Ms. Jennings gave her a small nod as the courtroom emptied. Outside in the hall, as the door shut behind her, Denise allowed herself one deep exhale. The courthouse buzzed with voices and footfalls, but inside her chest was a quiet storm: gratitude, grief, resolve. This wasn't the end. But it was no longer the beginning either. For the first time, the path forward felt real. It had been 3 days since the court adjourned, and Denise still hadn't fully come down from the weight of what had transpired. The judge's ruling had bought her time, a pause, not a victory, but in the world of legal proceedings, time was power. And power, she was learning, came in many quiet, careful forms. That Thursday afternoon, she stood in front of her brother's old house in Walnut Hills, a 2-story brick colonial with ivy creeping along one side and the scent of mulched flower beds lingering in the humid summer air. It was the first time she'd been back since the funeral. The new executor status gave her the right to secure and assess the property. Not that she wanted to. The house still felt like him, unfiltered, unfinished. The kind of place that refused to be claimed by anyone else. But if she was going to prove the letter's legitimacy, she needed to dig into Thomas's recent records, show patterns, uncover intention wherever she could. She unlocked the front door and stepped inside. It smelled faintly of dust and books, of the unbothered life of a single man with 1,000 unfinished projects. The same travel mugs lined the kitchen sink. His old University of Dayton jacket still hung on the hook by the stairs. For a moment, she just stood there, listening to the house breathe. Upstairs, in the study, she found the old roll-top desk where she'd last seen him scribbling notes during their occasional Sunday visits. She pulled out drawer after drawer, post-it notes, grocery lists, unopened bank statements. And finally, tucked inside a worn leather-bound notebook, she found more. March 5th, called Denise. Told her I was revising the will. Keep that damn pantry afloat. She'll understand. March 8th, gave money to Carter House. Told them not to thank me yet. Denise might have to deal with the red tape. Hope she's okay with it. March 12th. Letter's done. Sent it. Put my name on it. Not perfect, but it's what I mean. That's what matters. Denise carefully tore the page from the notebook and placed it in her folder. She scanned the room one last time, then noticed something behind. A stack of books on the shelf, a half-open envelope addressed to her, never mailed. She slid it out. Inside, a single piece of paper, folded unevenly. Den, if you ever end up back here, it means this all went sideways, huh? I didn't get to say it in person, so I'll say it now. Thank you. For trying. For not letting this get swept away. Do what you have to. Then get back to your life. Love. She pressed the letter to her chest and closed her eyes. Back home, Denise sat down at her desk and began outlining her argument for the August 5th hearing. The evidence now included the original handwritten letter, the voicemail, the notebook entries dated and corresponding to the letter, the unmailed envelope, a record of recent donations aligning with the letter's content, and her own sworn affidavit about conversations held in the weeks before his death. It wasn't airtight. Nothing ever was in probate court. But it was enough to ask the court to weigh not just legality, but truth. That evening, Janice came over. With 2 manila folders under her arm and a 6-pack of ginger ale. They sat at the kitchen table, their laptops open, surrounded by piles of documents and annotated court decisions. You're building something real here, Janice said, flipping through a legal pad filled with notes. This isn't just emotion. You've got a trail. I keep wondering what I'm really fighting for, Denise said. Is it just to honor Tom? Or is it about making sure people like Brad don't just assume they get to rewrite someone's life because they showed up with a better suit and a louder voice? Maybe both, Janice said gently. They worked until midnight. Denise reviewed procedural codes, highlighted case precedents, and rehearsed her delivery. She wasn't a lawyer, but she had become something else, something the courtroom hadn't been ready for: relentless, articulate, unafraid. Meanwhile, across town, Brad King sat in his penthouse apartment overlooking the Ohio River, a whiskey glass sweating on the counter. His lawyer had told him not to panic, that this kind of delay was normal, that the letter would never hold up. But he had seen Judge Callahan's face. And he had seen Denise stand there like she had nothing to lose. He knew she was dangerous, and now, he was beginning to realize just how much his father had kept from him. How much of Thomas Bartlett's final months had been shaped not by guilt or nostalgia, but by something deeper. A conscious turning away, Brad reached for his phone and dialed Lorna. Her voice was sharp, even over the speaker. "We need to talk about strategy," she said. "This woman, she's not just grieving. She's coming for the whole estate." "Yeah," Brad said quietly, staring out at the river. "I know." Back in her quiet home, Denise stood by the window, watching the thunderclouds gather over the city. The air was thick with summer rain. The trees swayed under the wind's rising weight. She thought of the courtroom. The silence when she spoke. The way truth didn't always land loudly, but when it did, it stayed. The real fight hadn't started yet. But she was ready. The week before the August 5th hearing unfolded like a slow, deliberate game of chess. Every day brought a new phone call, a new email, a new ripple of tension beneath the surface of what should have been a straightforward legal matter. But Denise was beginning to understand that nothing involving money and family ever stayed straightforward for long. It started with the letter from Brad's attorneys, delivered by courier, hand-signed, and thick with legalese. "Ms. Bartlett, we respectfully urge you to consider withdrawing your request for codicil recognition. In light of the absence of witnesses and the lack of formal notarization, we believe this case could escalate beyond your current ability to represent yourself effectively. We are open to a private negotiation to reach a mutually respectful conclusion." It was dressed up in politeness, but Denise read between the lines: back down, or be buried in process. She didn't respond. Instead, she added the letter to her folder under a new tab: implied pressure/leverage attempts. Just in case. On Wednesday afternoon, Denise stopped by Carter House, one of the nonprofits Thomas had named in his letter. It sat on a quiet corner off Reading Road, modest and clean, a former elementary school building converted into a resource center for housing and recovery. The director, a woman in her early 40s named Naomi Green, met her in the lobby. "I remember your brother well," Naomi said as they walked through the narrow hallways. "He wasn't loud, didn't talk about himself much. Just showed up, brought food, stayed late. Once came in on Christmas Eve just to paint a hallway." Denise smiled. "That sounds like him." Naomi led her into a small office stacked with donation records and intake forms. "We were surprised when the donation came through. It wasn't huge, $5,000, but it was unexpected. No note. Just a wire and a name. Thomas Bartlett." Denise reached into her bag and pulled out a printed copy of the letter. "He wrote about you. About this place. He wanted more to come your way." Naomi read the first few lines, then sat back slowly. "He never told me. Not once." "That's how you know he meant it," Denise said quietly. Naomi looked up. "If the court needs testimony or context, I'm happy to speak." He was quiet, but he was constant. The kind of volunteer you never had to ask twice. Denise left with Naomi's contact information and a sense of quiet momentum. This wasn't just about a letter anymore. It was about proving that Thomas's intentions weren't theoretical. They had already begun to manifest. That night, Denise received an unexpected phone call. "Ms. Bartlett? This is Lauren Avery with Ohio Evening News. I was forwarded your name through court records regarding a probate case in Hamilton County. Would you be open to speaking about the hearing?" Denise hesitated. "I'm not sure that's appropriate. It's a private matter." Lauren's voice softened. "I understand. But I've been covering inheritance disputes for years, and this one is unusual. A self-represented petitioner challenging formal heirs based on a handwritten letter? If you're willing, I'd love to get your perspective, on the record or not." "I'll think about it," Denise said. "But this isn't about headlines. It's about one man's last attempt to be understood. That's exactly what makes it worth telling." Denise didn't say yes. But she didn't hang up either. They spoke for 15 more minutes. Meanwhile, inside a sleek downtown law office with glass walls and low lighting, Samuel King sat with Brad and Lorna in a conference room. The atmosphere was tense. Lorna had her arms folded tightly, eyes sharp. "She's not going to back off," Brad said flatly. "You saw what the judge did. Gave her interim control. It's a message." Samuel sighed. "If we can't get her to withdraw, we'll have to dismantle the letter piece by piece. Attack the voicemail's authenticity. Undermine the notebook entries. Make it look like a grieving sister's projection, not a binding intention. Lorna leaned forward. What if we disqualify her completely? Show that she's compromised? Emotionally unstable. Biased. Too close to the issue to be credible. Samuel looked up, surprised. That's a hard angle. It doesn't need to stick, Lorna said. Just needs to rattle her. Make her doubt herself. Make the court hesitate. Brad looked away, silent. On Friday, Denise received another letter, this one from a private investigator hired by Brad's legal team. It stated that her actions were being reviewed for potential undue influence over the decedent in his final months. The accusation was carefully worded, but unmistakable. They were coming for her character now. Janice read it and scoffed. This is their play? Undue influence? That's a stretch. Denise wasn't sure whether to laugh or cry. They're accusing me of manipulating my own brother into giving his money to charity? Janice leaned across the table. It means they're nervous. Or that they'll say anything if it keeps their client rich. Same thing. Denise stared at the paper. The storm was here, full force. But she wasn't going to run. Not when every attempt to shake her only strengthened her resolve. She stood, crossed the room, and pulled a framed photo off her shelf, her and Thomas at her retirement ceremony. Both of them grinning like teenagers. She set it beside her files. The hearing was 3 days away, let them come. She had truth on her side. And now, she had proof. The courtroom was unusually full on the morning of August 5. Word had spread, quietly, but efficiently, that a self-represented retiree was challenging a well-funded legal team over a handwritten will amendment. Law students had taken interest. A local legal ethics professor was rumored to be observing. Even the reporter from Ohio Evening News, Lauren Avery, sat discreetly near the back, notebook in hand. Denise sat alone at her table in courtroom 3B, her folder of documents laid out. With quiet precision. Every tab, every note, every printed piece of evidence had been prepared and reviewed, not by a firm, but by her. She wore the same navy blazer, a small nod to consistency, a visual cue that she hadn't changed since day one, but the story certainly had. Across the aisle, Brad sat with Lorna and their attorneys. Samuel King looked tense but controlled, flipping through pages and whispering strategy. The previous smirk was gone. This was now a case they could lose. Judge Callahan entered at 9:01 a.m. sharp, eyes scanning the room more thoroughly than before. He adjusted his robe, sat down, and spoke with the quiet authority of a man fully present. This session is now in order. We are here to determine whether the handwritten letter submitted by Ms. Denise Bartlett meets the legal threshold for consideration as a codicil to the will of the late Thomas Bartlett. Counsel, you may proceed. Samuel King stood. Your Honor, we maintain that the letter in question fails all legal standards for amendment. It isn't signed by witnesses. It is unnotarized. It was not filed with the official will. We further submit that Ms. Bartlett, while articulate, is neither a legal professional nor an unbiased party. Her proximity to the decedent raises serious questions about influence and motive. He paused, then added, we have submitted a letter of concern regarding Ms. Bartlett's role, citing behavior consistent with undue influence. We request that her testimony be weighed accordingly. Denise didn't flinch. She had expected this. She rose when the judge gestured. Your Honor, I am my brother's sister, yes. That makes me close, but not dishonest. I am not a lawyer. But I am a person who loved my brother and understood the life he led, quietly, deliberately. The letter is not a stray note. It is detailed. It names specific charitable beneficiaries. It mirrors donations he made in the months leading up to his death. And it is consistent with the values he lived by, even if he didn't always speak about them. She picked up a page and held it up. This is a voicemail from March 15, where Thomas says, if I don't get this thing notarized, I at least hope they'll read it. He wasn't confused. He wasn't coerced. He was trying to make himself heard, despite the bureaucracy. Judge Callahan nodded. And the evidence submitted includes confirmation of those donations? Yes, Your Honor, Denise said. Carter House has provided a sworn affidavit. So has the 8th Street Pantry. I've also included pages from my brother's journal, dated and written in his own hand, referencing the letter, and specifically mentioning his change of heart. The judge looked through the documents carefully. Then he turned to Naomi Green, seated on the witness bench. Ms. Green, you are the director of Carter House? Yes, sir, Naomi said. Thomas volunteered for over a year with us. He was consistent, kind, and yes, he sent a donation shortly before his death. No letter, just the money. That was who he was. Would you say the letter submitted matches what you observed of his behavior and priorities? Absolutely. Without hesitation. The judge nodded. Then he called on Janice, who testified about the voicemail's metadata and the document timeline. Finally, he gestured for Denise to return to the stand. Ms. Bartlett, one final question. Why didn't your brother simply revise his will through an attorney? Denise paused. This was the moment. He lost faith in the system, Your Honor. After the divorce, after years of watching people twist his intentions for their gain, he stopped trusting legal channels to reflect his choices. But he didn't stop caring. He chose a different route, flawed, yes, but honest. I think he thought if he wrote it clearly enough, someone, anyone, would do the right thing. The judge was quiet for a long time. The courtroom was completely still. Then, the law recognizes not just formality, but intent, provided the evidence is credible, the behavior consistent, and the writing specific. In this case, I find that the letter submitted by Ms. Bartlett does meet the minimum standard for testamentary codicil. It is to be entered into probate as a valid amendment to Thomas Bartlett's will. A collective breath seemed to leave the room. Denise didn't smile. She just lowered her head slightly, grateful. Judge Callahan added, further, I find no merit to the undue influence claim. Ms. Bartlett's conduct has been methodical, restrained, and entirely appropriate. Her interim executor role is now formalized for the purpose of implementing the revised distributions as outlined. Samuel King's mouth tightened. Brad looked stunned. Lorna whispered something under her breath. Denise gathered her papers slowly, deliberately. As she stood, the judge said one last thing. Ms. Bartlett. You've demonstrated something we don't see often in this courtroom. Clarity without training. Dignity without power. And truth without theatrics. That's rare. Thank you. She nodded. Thank you, Your Honor. Outside the courthouse, the sky had cleared. The last of the summer rain had washed the city in a quiet sheen. Lauren Avery caught up with her just outside the building. Ms. Bartlett, any comment for the paper? Denise looked at her, considered it, then said quietly, sometimes the hardest thing is saying the right thing when no one wants to hear it. But that doesn't mean you stop speaking. Then she walked away, folder in hand, the photo of her and Thomas tucked safely inside. It wasn't just a win. It was a restoration. 3 days after the ruling, Denise sat at the long dining room table in her modest Cincinnati home, the sun spilling gently across her open folder of estate documents. The ruling had gone in her favor, legally, definitively, but there was no champagne, no celebratory dinner. Only silence. And paperwork. The court's acceptance of the letter as a valid codicil meant one thing: she was now legally responsible for administering the revised estate. A woman with no background in finance or law was suddenly navigating property evaluations, non-profit disbursements, and difficult conversations with people who had just lost what they thought was theirs. She hadn't yet heard from Brad or Lorna. That silence said more than any statement could. On Thursday morning, Denise drove to her brother's former bank. She had an appointment with the estate officer, a well-dressed woman named Evelyn Sayer, who handled the transfer of trust and estate accounts. Evelyn glanced up from the screen. The updated court order grants you full executorship, Ms. Bartlett. I've reviewed the ruling in codicil. Our compliance team signed off on it yesterday. Thank you, Denise said softly. We'll transfer the accounts into an estate management fund. You'll have the authority to issue distributions based on the new allocations. Denise pulled a neatly organized sheet from her folder. I'd like to begin with these: Carter House and the 8th Street Pantry. Equal distributions. And I'd like to write a letter to accompany the funds, nothing public, just personal acknowledgement. Evelyn raised her eyebrows, pleasantly surprised. Not many executors take the time to do that. I don't see it as an obligation, Denise replied. It's a responsibility. After the meeting, she sat in her car for several minutes. Before driving away, her hand resting on the steering wheel. The city was quiet at mid-morning. No horns. No rush. Just a steady hum of life continuing. For Denise, though, everything felt slightly rearranged. That evening, her phone buzzed. Brad King, unknown number. She debated answering. Then she did. Hello? There was a pause. Ms. Bartlett. It's Brad. Denise sat back in her chair. I figured. I'm not calling to argue. Then what are you calling for? Brad hesitated. I read the court transcript. Everything. I didn't know half of what my dad had been doing. Volunteering, donating, writing about all of it. I didn't know he was even still in touch with you that often. Denise exhaled. He didn't talk about it. He just did it. Look, Brad continued, I'm not going to pretend I'm okay with the outcome. I lost something I thought was mine. But I've also been thinking about how I didn't even know what he valued at the end. That hurts more than the money. Silence stretched between them. I'm sorry, Brad said finally. Denise's voice was measured. He would have liked to hear that. I wish you'd said it to him. So do I. Neither one of them knew what to say next. I won't contest the ruling, Brad said after a long pause. My attorney still wants to file for partial appeal. I told him to stand down. I don't want to keep fighting something that was probably right from the start. Denise closed her eyes. Thank you. He hung up without saying goodbye. But somehow, that call had been more honest than anything he'd said in court. 2 days later, Denise sat across from Naomi Green again, this time in the staff break room at Carter House. Naomi opened the envelope Denise had brought and blinked. At the contents, this is more than I ever imagined. It's what he wanted, Denise said. This, and the pantry. He saw something in the work you were doing. It mattered to him. Naomi looked at her, eyes shimmering. You didn't have to fight for it. You could have just walked away. I think he needed someone to stand still when the current was trying to drag everything under. I happened to be the one who could. Naomi was quiet for a moment. We'll put this into expansion, build a permanent meal prep room, maybe even a second-floor shelter pod. He's going to keep helping people for years. Denise smiled faintly. That sounds right. Later that evening, alone in her house, Denise began going through a few last items from Thomas's home. She hadn't cleared it out entirely yet, but she had brought back a few boxes of books and photos, things she didn't trust to strangers. Inside one of the boxes, tucked between a history textbook and an old pocket watch, was a faded envelope. Her name was written in block letters. No stamp. No return address. Just Denise in thick black ink. Inside, a short note. If you're reading this, you finished it. I don't know what it cost you. I hope not too much. But I want you to know something. I didn't leave the money to you because I thought you needed it. I left you the work because I knew you wouldn't walk away. You always stayed. Even when it was hard. Especially then, thank you. She read it twice, then placed it gently into her desk drawer. It had never been about the money. Not for her. Not for Thomas. It had always been about what we leave behind, when no one's looking, when no one's applauding. About whether someone, somewhere, cared enough to keep that piece of us from fading, and Denise had done just that, quietly. Carefully, with grace. A week after the final ruling, Denise found herself in unfamiliar territory, the quiet aftermath. The courthouse email stopped. No more certified letters on the porch. No more phone calls from Janice late at night reading her civil code. The pace had slowed, but her thoughts hadn't. Victory in court had come with a strange silence, one filled not with relief, but with reckoning. Clarity, it turned out, had a cost. She stepped out onto her porch one warm morning with a mug of black coffee, her spine aching slightly from the hours spent over estate spreadsheets. In the old maple tree near the curb, cicadas buzzed in the thick summer heat, their sound distant and relentless, like memory itself. The city moved on around her, people walking dogs, cars humming down the street, a child's laughter echoing from 2 houses over. But Denise sat still, feeling the weight of what had been settled. And what hadn't, because the truth was, Thomas's estate had created ripples in places she hadn't expected. The next day, Denise was stopped in the grocery store by someone she vaguely recognized from the local community center, a woman in her late 60s with a cart full of canned soup and off-brand cereal. You're the one from the inheritance case, right? The woman asked gently. Denise hesitated. Yes. I just wanted to say, it mattered. What you did. My son's in recovery, he goes to Carter House. Told me about the new upgrades. They said it was because of a donation. Said it came from someone's brother. Denise blinked. Caught off guard. That was Thomas. The woman placed her hand on Denise's wrist. Thank you. For fighting. For not letting them forget the quiet ones. It wasn't a dramatic moment. It didn't come with applause. Just a soft nod between 2 women who knew how heavy quiet could be, but not everyone was quiet. That evening, an email from Lorna arrived. Short. Cold. You won your narrative. Congratulations. I hope the nonprofits appreciate what they took from his family. Whatever piece you think you've earned, it came at a cost you'll never fully understand. Denise stared at it for several long moments. Her hand hovered over the keyboard. But she didn't respond. She'd already said everything that mattered, in court, in her actions, in the letter she'd sent Lorna after the ruling, which had gone unanswered. Some people didn't want peace. They wanted power. And when that failed, they wanted someone to blame. Denise wouldn't give her either. Later that week, Denise visited the 8th Street pantry for the first time since the funds had been transferred. The director, a thin man named Arthur with kind eyes and dirt-stained jeans, gave her a tour of the new refrigeration unit they were able to install because of the donation. We're prepping to double capacity next month, Arthur said. The grant from your brother's estate filled a huge gap. Volunteers are coming in again. People are hopeful. Denise nodded, letting her fingers trail along the smooth edge of a new steel countertop. He'd have liked this. Arthur paused, looking at her. You okay? It was the first time anyone had asked. Denise smiled faintly. I'm still figuring that out. But the toll was real. She'd lost more than time and sleep. She'd lost the quiet image she once had of her brother's past. Thomas, who had always seemed indifferent to legacy, had turned out to be a man deeply concerned with how his last acts would land. And Brad, despite his coldness, had exposed a painful truth. No one really knew everything about the people they loved, and maybe that was the point. Maybe love wasn't about knowing. Maybe it was about trusting anyway. One evening, she sat in her study, writing a letter of her own, not for court, not for the record, but for herself. Her handwriting was slower than it used to be, but careful. Thomas, the letter is filed. The money's where you wanted it. The people you trusted? They're still doing the work. I keep thinking about the day you showed up with that broken desk lamp, asking if I had time to help you fix it. You never cared about the lamp. You just didn't know how to say, "Can we talk?" You never said, "Thank you." But I know you meant it. And now, I guess, it's my turn. Thank you for trusting me to stay when you left. She folded the letter, placed it in an envelope, and tucked it into the notebook she'd recovered from his study. There was no address to send it to. That wasn't the point. Later that night, she stood in front of her mirror and saw herself differently, not just as someone who had endured, but as someone who had altered the course of something bigger than herself. Not just legally, but emotionally, culturally. Silently, she had taken on the kind of fight that most people sidestepped, because it was inconvenient, unglamorous, and offered no guarantees, and she had won, not loudly, not triumphantly, but truthfully, and that was enough. It was a bright Monday morning, and the humidity in Cincinnati had finally begun to lift. Summer was sliding quietly toward its end, just a hint in the breeze, in the way shadows stretched a little longer across sidewalks. Denise sat in her car outside a small cafe in Clifton, watching the front door with a cautious stillness. Brad had asked to meet. No lawyers. No hidden agenda, at least not one he'd stated. Just a message sent 2 days earlier, "I think we should talk." Face to face. She had almost ignored it, but then she thought about what it meant, for him to reach out, for her to agree. And she realized that whether or not anything good came from it, this was a thread that still needed to be pulled. Not for closure. Not even for peace. But for clarity. So she came. Brad arrived exactly on time. Not late, not early. He spotted her through the glass and nodded before walking in. He looked different. Not softer, not quite, just quieter. Less armored. They ordered coffee, sat at a small corner table, and for a while, said nothing. Brad finally broke the silence. "Thank you for agreeing to this." Denise folded her hands in her lap. "Why now?" He took a breath. "Because I owe you a conversation that's not filtered through court transcripts or legal threats." She nodded, waiting. "I was angry," Brad said. "Still am, in some ways. I grew up believing my father didn't care much about causes, or charity, or integrity, honestly. He was withdrawn, he was bitter, and he was always." He paused. "He wasn't the man you knew at the end." "No," Denise said gently. "He wasn't. I thought I knew him. I thought I understood what his legacy should be. And then I sat in that courtroom, listening to you, hearing about the donations, the volunteering. And I realized how much of him I'd missed. Or maybe ignored." Denise sipped her coffee, letting his words land without rescuing him from them. "I'm not here to apologize and pretend that makes it all clean," Brad continued. "But I did some thinking. Went to Carter House. Walked through 8th Street Pantry. Talked to people who said my dad showed up more for them than he ever did for me." Denise said nothing. "That's hard to sit with," he admitted. "Knowing he chose to be known by strangers when he wouldn't pick up my calls. But it wasn't your fault. And it wasn't your job to make me feel better about it." He looked up, eyes clear now. "So? I just wanted to say thank you. For fighting for what he meant, not just what he left." Denise studied him for a moment. She could still see the tightness in his jaw, the carefulness in his posture. But she also saw something she hadn't before: humility without defeat. A man learning the limits of what money could restore. "I didn't do it for him alone," she said softly. "I did it for what he realized too late. That we're remembered by where we give, not what we keep." Brad nodded slowly. "Would it be strange if I asked to be part of it? The work? I don't mean the money. I mean, the places. The pantry. Carter House." Denise blinked. "Why?" "Because it's the only way I know how to get closer to him now. Not through memory, but through action." She stared at him, unsure for a beat. Then something inside her softened. "Then start by showing up," she said. "No headlines. No checks. Just your hands. Your time." "I can do that," he said. They didn't finish their coffee. When they parted ways outside, Denise didn't offer to stay in touch, and Brad didn't promise to call. It was enough, in that moment, that they had seen each other honestly. Later that afternoon, Denise returned home to find a package on her front porch. No return address. Inside was a framed photo, Thomas, younger, bearded, laughing in a way she hadn't seen in decades. A sticky note on the back read, "Found this in one of his old college boxes. Thought it belonged to someone who remembered him that way. No signature." She placed it on the mantel, not as a trophy. As a reminder that people are more than the worst versions of themselves. That change, however late, is still change. And that sometimes, a quiet fight can open a door someone else didn't know they needed. The following weekend, Denise showed up at Carter House as she often did, clipboard in hand, hair pulled back, ready to help sort weekend donations. Naomi smiled and waved her over. "There's a new volunteer today," Naomi said, gesturing toward the back. Brad stood near the pantry bins, sleeves rolled up, silently loading bags of rice onto the shelves. He didn't see Denise watching, and she didn't interrupt. Some things didn't need to be spoken anymore, some things were better left to action. By the second week of September, Cincinnati had slipped into that golden lull between summer and fall, when the heat finally surrendered, and the air felt crisp enough to carry memory. Leaves hadn't turned yet, but the mornings came cooler. The kind of days that made Denise think of old chalkboards and school bells, of hallways echoing with kids returning after a long break. It had been over a month since the ruling. And though the estate work was still ongoing, tax filings, final disbursements, maintenance of Thomas's property, the noise had settled. The courtroom drama, the meetings with attorneys, the tension, they had quieted into something slower, steadier, almost livable. But some things stayed. That afternoon, Denise sat in the library of the community center, leading the first meeting of a new volunteer group she had quietly started organizing after the estate's resolution. A mix of locals, teachers, retirees, and nonprofit staff filled the room. She called it the legacy table. "Our goal," she said, "is to make sure no one's intentions get lost in noise. Whether it's a planned donation, a cause someone believed in, or just a final letter, we want to make sure it doesn't vanish in legal dust or family tension. We help people tell the truth about what mattered to them." She didn't mention Thomas by name. She didn't need to. After the meeting, a woman stayed behind. Her name was Lila, soft-spoken and recently widowed. She held a wrinkled envelope in her hand and asked quietly, "Do you think this would hold up in court?" "It's just, my husband wrote it 1 week before he passed." Denise looked at it carefully. Familiar folds. A hesitant signature. Simple language. "I think it could," she said. "But more importantly, I think it should." Back at home. That night, Denise finally opened the last sealed box from Thomas's house. She'd been avoiding it, not out of fear, but timing. She wanted to meet it with stillness, not strategy. Inside were stacks of old notebooks, a cigar box filled with old receipts and photos, and a collection of cassette tapes labeled in ballpoint pen, 1987. "Letters I never sent." She pulled one out and placed it into the ancient tape player from the attic. It clicked, buzzed, and then hissed softly as a younger version of her brother's voice came through the speaker, unpolished, nervous. "Dear Denise, I don't really know how to say things out loud, so I thought I'd try this. I messed up again today with Brad. I think I keep failing as a father. And it's easier to pretend I don't care than admit I do. But you always knew that about me, didn't you?" Her chest tightened. "I hope someday we talk more. Not just about mom's checkups or school stuff. I mean really talk. Like when we were kids, and you used to correct my spelling in my stories. And pretend it was fun." He chuckled, a soft static-laced laugh. "If I never get there, and I probably won't, just know I saw you. Always. You were never background. You were the one holding the thread." She paused the tape, her hands trembling slightly. There were 5 more like it in the box. She didn't play them. Not yet. Some truths could wait. Others had already arrived. A few days later, Denise walked into Carter House and found Brad already there, standing with 2 volunteers in the corner of the kitchen, laughing at something one of them said. He looked up when she walked in and gave a small wave, nothing exaggerated, just familiar now. "You're early," she said, stepping into the supply room with him. "I like the quiet before things get busy," Brad replied. "Helps me think." She handed him a clipboard. "Pantry list. We're low on staples." He glanced at the items. "Got it. I'll run inventory." They worked in companionable silence. No apologies. No rehashing. Just the clatter of crates. And the scent of fresh bread from the donation bags. As they left that afternoon, Brad asked, "Do you ever miss the courtroom?" Denise shook her head. "No. I miss being heard, sometimes. But not the room." He nodded. "You were good in there." She smiled faintly. "I wasn't trying to be good. I was trying to be clear." That weekend, she visited Thomas's grave for the first time since the ruling. She brought no flowers, no dramatic gestures. Just the framed photo Brad had sent her weeks ago, the one with Thomas laughing, full-faced and bright, and placed it quietly beside the headstone. I kept my word, she whispered, then, almost without realizing it, she added, you did too. A breeze stirred through the cemetery. The trees swayed gently above. Somewhere inside, she knew, he had changed. Not because he found peace, but because he tried. Because he left a trace of his better self in a letter, in a pantry, in a shelter, in her hands, and now, it was in hers to carry forward. As she walked back to her car, her phone buzzed, a message from Janice. That article about your case is up. Local news picked it up too. It's titled, The Quiet Executor. Thought you'd want to know. Denise smiled at the title, then slipped the phone into her pocket. She didn't need the article, she had the truth, and that was what stayed. By mid-October, a subtle transformation had settled over Cincinnati. Trees flushed amber and rust along the sidewalks, and the air grew sharper with each passing morning. Denise walked through Eden Park with her coat buttoned high, a notebook tucked under her arm, and a thermos of coffee in her hand. Autumn had always been her favorite, honest, transitional, dignified in its fading. It made space for reflection. She had become, to her quiet surprise, something of a local fixture. Not famous, not even well known. But recognized. Strangers at the farmer's market nodded in passing. A man at the post office had asked her what intent really meant when it came to wills. And last week, a young law student had emailed her to ask if she'd be willing to speak at a university forum on layperson advocacy in the probate system. I'm not a lawyer, she'd replied. That's exactly why we want you, the student had written back. She hadn't said yes. But she hadn't deleted the message either. That same week, she was invited to speak to the Carter House board about the long-term impact of Thomas's donation. The meeting was small, informal, held in the converted gymnasium where folding chairs made a wide circle on the hardwood floor. Naomi introduced her, then stepped back. Denise stood with a small stack of notes she never ended up using. My brother's gift wasn't born out of ease, she said, voice clear. He didn't write that letter because everything in his life had gone well. He wrote it because it hadn't. And because, in the end, he didn't want silence to have the last word. She paused. I didn't stand in court to rewrite his story. I stood to finish it the way he asked it to be finished. There's a difference. When she sat down, Naomi placed a hand on her shoulder and whispered, you've started something here. You know that, right? Denise nodded, not out of pride, but out of quiet responsibility. She knew. A few days later, Denise received a call from a woman named Gloria Webb, 68 years old, widow, no children. She'd read about Denise in the Cincinnati Enquirer. I've written a letter, Gloria said. It's not notarized. It's more, me talking to the people I'll leave behind. I don't trust my niece to handle it right. I want someone to review it, not as a lawyer, but as someone who understands why someone would write it in the first place. Denise met her at a diner near the river. They sat by the window and reviewed the letter together. Denise offered only one suggestion. A line at the end that said, this is not just a letter. This is my voice. Gloria smiled. That sounds like something you'd say. Denise looked down at the paper. It's something Thomas didn't say. Not directly. But he meant it. Meanwhile, Brad continued showing up to Carter House each week. He never asked for attention. He never brought up the estate. He just worked, sorting inventory, sweeping the floors, offering rides to other volunteers. Denise watched, always from a distance, until the day she found him sitting alone on the back steps after a long shift. He was holding a photo from the new community bulletin board, a woman and two kids standing in front of the shelter pod, smiling. Arms full of groceries. I helped deliver that cart, he said. Didn't even realize what it was for at the time. Denise sat beside him. That's how it works. You never see the full shape of a moment until you look back at it. He nodded. Do you think he'd be proud of this? I think, she said carefully, he was trying to become someone he could be proud of. You're picking up where he stopped. Brad looked away, eyes wet. It's hard. Forgiveness. It's not instant, is it? No, Denise said. It's an action, not a feeling. You do it until it becomes part of who you are. They sat quietly for a while after that. There were no perfect words, and they didn't need them. The following week, Denise finally replied to the law student. She agreed to speak. Not because she wanted attention, but because something in her knew the work wasn't finished, not just Thomas's, but her own. The probate hearing may have ended, but the deeper fight, the one for dignity, legacy, and truth, was still quietly unfolding in homes and hearts across the city. She began outlining a talk titled, The Quiet Executor. When the truth is unrepresented. At home, her desk had changed. No longer crowded with legal documents, it now held thank you notes from nonprofits, hand-drawn cards from volunteers, and a copy of the original letter, Thomas's, now laminated and gently framed. She looked at it often. Not as proof of the past, but as a compass for the future, because Denise had come to understand something that few people ever fully grasp. Some people write their legacy in ink. Others write it in silence, trusting someone else to give it voice, and she had given it voice, not as a savior, not as a sister, but as someone who refused to let the truth be buried under what was easy, and for that, she no longer needed a courtroom. She had already made her case. By late October, Cincinnati's skyline softened under dusky pinks and burning oranges. The last of the leaves clung stubbornly to their branches, and a quiet settled over the city, the kind that came before winter arrived with its blanketing. Hush, Denise Bartlett sat on her porch wrapped in a wool shawl, a legal pad resting on her lap. She wasn't preparing for court, or responding to a claim, or outlining an argument. She was writing something far simpler. A will, her own.it wasn't morbid. It wasn't even emotional. It was practical, an act of clarity, a kindness to whoever came after her. She had learned, more intimately than most, what happened when intentions weren't spoken plainly. When trust was assumed instead of declared. She wrote slowly, precisely. Her language was plain: what would go where, who would receive what, and why. But at the end, she added a few lines in her own voice, not legal, not binding, but human. If this letter ever ends up in someone else's hands, please know, my life was ordinary in all the best ways. I had peace. I had people I loved. And I had the chance to make one thing right when it mattered most. That was enough. She set the pen down and let the ink dry. Then she folded the paper carefully, placed it in a folder marked personal, to be read first, and tucked it into her fireproof box, beside the framed letter from Thomas. The day of her talk at the law school arrived on a bright Saturday. The building was modern, glass and brick, filled with the murmur of students and the sound of shoes echoing off marble floors. Denise had dressed simply, navy pantsuit, the same one she'd worn to court. Familiar armor. The classroom was packed, dozens of students, a few professors, even some local attorneys seated along the back wall. She stood at the front of the room with her notes in hand but didn't look down at them once. I'm not here to teach you the law, she began. You already have professors for that. I'm here to remind you of something you might forget along the way. The people who don't speak your language, who don't know your system, still have truths worth hearing. She told them about her brother. About the letter. About what it meant to carry the weight of someone's final request through a process that wasn't built to hear from people like her, and then she told them this: don't mistake silence for weakness. Don't confuse a shaky voice for a shaky case. And when someone stands alone in your courtroom, don't ask whether they belong there. Ask what brought them there, and whether you're strong enough to listen. When she finished, the room was quiet for a long moment before someone began to clap. Then another. Then the room was on its feet. She didn't beam. She didn't bow. She simply nodded, grateful. Afterward, a few students stayed behind. One of them, a young woman with wide eyes and a voice barely above a whisper, approached her with a question. How did you keep going, even when they tried to discredit you? Denise thought about it. Because the truth doesn't always shout, she said. Sometimes it just waits for someone to say, I believe this matters. That evening, she stopped by Carter House again. Naomi met her at the door, arms folded over her chest with that same knowing smile she always had when something good had just happened. Brad finished the second floor this week, she said. He didn't tell anyone. Just showed up, kept working, and one day it was done. Denise peeked into the newly painted hallway upstairs. The walls were soft blue. The flooring was fresh. A quote had been painted in black script across the center: legacy is what we do when no one's watching. She felt something settle in her chest. He hadn't been perfect. He'd been late. He'd failed and tried again. But he'd meant this. All of it, and she had carried it. A few weeks later, Denise stood before a small group at the legacy table, reading the latest letter someone had brought in, an uncle's final message to his niece, scribbled on the back of a restaurant receipt. They were workshopping ways to preserve the document's integrity and meaning. The group had grown, some retired teachers, a few paralegals, a nurse, 2 pastors, and even a young man studying social work. One person at a time, they were creating a quiet movement, a space where voices that might be overlooked could become lasting, legal, and heard. When the meeting ended, Denise lingered behind to clean up. Brad stepped in, carrying a box of tea. For the next session, you really started something here, he said. I didn't start it, Denise replied, straightening the chairs. Thomas did. I just refused to ignore it. On a quiet Sunday, she walked back through Eden Park, the same winding path she'd taken after her court hearing. The trees were bare now. The air was colder. And still, the path felt the same. Forward. As she sat on the same bench beneath the stone archway, she pulled out the letter she'd written to Thomas, the one she'd never mailed, never shown. She read it again, not to remember, but to honor. You didn't need to be perfect. You just needed someone to believe you still meant something. I did. And I always will." She folded it once more and, this time, left it there, beneath the bench, sealed in a plastic envelope with a note that read, "For someone trying to do the right thing late. It's never too late." And then she walked home. Hands in her pockets, the wind in her hair. No crowd. No trial. No noise, just one woman, who had stood still when everyone told her to leave, who stayed. Who listened. Who was, in every way that mattered, the quiet executor. And the echo she carried would last.